The wind didn't howl and Red Hollow. It cut, sharp and deliberate, like a blade testing for weakness. Mara Ellison knew that wind. She'd learned its rhythms the way some people learned prayers, out of necessity, out of the knowledge that paying attention was the only thing standing between survival and surrender. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the last gray light bleed out of the sky. The cabin was cold. It was always cold. The stove worked, barely, but fuel cost money she didn't have, so she burned what she could scavenge. Deadfall from the woods, scraps from the mill, sometimes nothing at all. 28 years old, and this was her inheritance. 4 walls that leaked. A life that didn't. Mara wasn't ugly. That would have been easier somehow, something definitive to point at, to name. Instead, she existed in that worst of all categories. Forgettable. Too heavy in a world that prized delicacy. Too plain in a town that measured women by how well they caught the light. Not worth the second glance, let alone the first. She'd learned early not to expect much. Her mother had died when Mara was 12. Fever, quick, and brutal. Her father lasted 3 more years before the drink took what the grief had already hollowed out. No siblings, no extended family willing to claim a girl who'd only be another mouth to feed. The town had tried, in its half-hearted way. A few families took her in for a season or two, but charity had limits, especially when the recipient wasn't particularly grateful or particularly pleasant to look at. By 16, Mara was on her own. By 18, she'd stopped expecting anything different. She cooked because she had to eat. She traded because she had to survive. Bread for firewood, preserves for flour, mending for meat. A careful economy of necessities that kept her alive but never comfortable, visible but never seen. The knock, when it came, wasn't tentative. 3 heavy strikes against wood, the kind that said, "I know you're in there, and I'm not leaving until you answer." Mara's hand stilled on the pot she'd been scrubbing. Visitors were rare. Welcome ones didn't exist. She dried her hands and crossed to the door, every instinct telling her not to open it. But instinct was a luxury. Out here, ignoring a knock could mean missing the one piece of news that mattered. A storm coming, a road closed, something that could kill you if you didn't know about it in time. She pulled the door open 6 inches and looked out. The man on her porch was tall. That was the first thing. Not unusually so, but tall in a way that seemed to gather the space around him, compress it into something denser. He wore a heavy coat dark with weather, and his hat was pulled low enough that she couldn't see much of his face beyond the hard line of his jaw and the shadow of several days' stubble. "Mara Ellison." His voice matched the knock, blunt, direct. "Depends on who's asking." "Rhett Calder. I run the ranch north of here." She knew the name. Everyone did. Calder Ridge was one of the big operations. Land stretching up into the high country, cattle counts in the hundreds. The kind of place that kept men employed and the town supplied. She'd never been there. Never had reason to be. "What do you want?" He shifted his weight, and the porch boards creaked under him. "Need to talk. Can I come in?" "No." A pause, then something that might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell in the failing light. "Fair enough. Then I'll say it plain. My cook died 2 weeks ago. Heart gave out. I need someone who can feed 20 men, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. Heard you might be able to do it." Mara felt something tighten in her chest. Not hope. She'd trained herself out of that. But its dangerous cousin, possibility. "Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" "Might. Mill owner's wife. Said you brought her a plum cake last spring that was the best thing she'd eaten in 5 years. He paused. "Said you could make a feast out of nothing. That's the skill I need." Mara's mind raced. The cake had been a trade, flour for mending. She'd spent 2 days on it, because Mrs. Halstead had been kind once, years ago, and Mara had a long memory for kindness. "I'm not—" She stopped. "Not what? Not pretty enough to work in a house full of men? Not refined enough for a ranch like Calder Ridge? Not worth hiring?" She started again. "I cook for myself. That's different than cooking for a crew." "You cook for trade." "I've asked around. You do it well." His gaze was steady, unflinching. "I'm not looking for fancy. I'm looking for someone who shows up and doesn't quit. Someone who can turn what we have into something men will eat without complaining." "Why me?" "Because I've been through 6 applicants, and they all wanted wages I can't pay, or conditions I can't promise. You need work. I need a cook. Seems straightforward." There it was. The truth beneath the offer. Not because she was talented, not because she was wanted, because she was desperate enough to say yes and cheap enough to afford. She should have been insulted, maybe she was, under the exhaustion. But insult didn't pay for firewood. What's the wage? He named a figure. It wasn't generous, but it wasn't insulting either. More than she made now, enough to matter. Room and board included, he added. You'd have your own cabin. Small, but it's solid. Warmer than this. He glanced past her into the dim interior of her current home, and she hated that he could see it. The poverty, the cold, the bareness of it all. I'd have to think about it. Fair. But I need an answer by tomorrow night. I've got men who are getting restless, and a crew that doesn't eat well doesn't work well. He turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. They'll test you. The men. They're not used to taking orders from a woman, and they're not used to change. Some of them will push. Some of them will wait for you to fail. And you're telling me this why? Because if you take this job, I need you to last longer than a week. I don't have time to keep training replacements. He met her eyes, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity, not contempt, just a kind of blunt assessment. You walk in there soft, they'll break you. You walk in there ready to fight, they'll respect it even if they hate you for it. Sounds welcoming. It's a ranch, not a church social. They're hard men doing hard work in a hard place, but they're not cruel, not most of them. They just need to know you're not going to fold. Mara held his gaze. I've been folding my whole life, Mr. Calder. I'm still here. This time the smile was definite. Brief, but real. Then maybe you're tougher than you look. He left after that, boots heavy on the porch steps, and Mara closed the door against the cold. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by the stove with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and made a list in her head of all the reasons to say no. The men would hate her. She'd fail. She'd be humiliated. She'd lose the little stability she had. Then she made a list of reasons to say yes. Money. A warm place to sleep. Work that mattered, even if the people didn't want her doing it. And underneath it all, quieter but impossible to ignore. What if this is the only chance you get? By dawn, she'd made her decision. Rhett Calder returned the next evening, same time, same knock. Mara opened the door before he could land the third strike. I'll do it, she said. But I need 3 days to pack and settle things here. You'll have 2. We're already behind. Fine. 2. He nodded. I'll send a wagon at first light day after tomorrow. Bring what you need. Everything else we can manage. I'll need full access to the kitchen. No one tells me how to run it. Agreed. And if your men have a problem with me, they take it up with you, not me. I'm there to cook, not referee. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or approval. Deal. They stood there for a moment, the terms settled, the agreement made. Mara felt the weight of it, the finality. She'd just agreed to upend her entire life for a job that might chew her up and spit her out inside of a month. You'll do fine, Rhett said. And it didn't sound like reassurance. It sounded like a prediction. How do you know? Because you didn't ask if the men would like you. You asked if they'd leave you alone to do your job. That tells me you know the difference between being wanted and being useful. He left again, and Mara closed the door. 2 days. She had 2 days to pack up a life that barely existed and prepare for one that might not want her. She got to work. The wagon arrived exactly when Rhett said it would, just after sunrise, driven by a lean man with a face like old leather and eyes that took in everything without seeming to look at anything. Name's Gage, he said by way of greeting. You ready? Mara gestured to the 3 crates stacked by her door. That's everything. He raised an eyebrow. That's it? That's it. Light traveler. He climbed down and hefted the first crate into the wagon bed with ease. Mara grabbed the second before he could, ignoring the way her shoulder protested the weight. She wasn't about to start this job by looking weak. The ride to Calder Ridge took most of the morning. The road, and she used the term generously, wound through pine forest and open grassland, climbing gradually into rougher country. The cold bit harder up here, and the wind had nothing to stop it. Gage didn't talk much. Mara was grateful for that. She spent the time watching the landscape change, trying not to think about what waited at the end of the road. When they finally crested a rise and the ranch came into view, she felt her stomach drop. It was bigger than she'd expected. The main house sat at the center, 2 stories, solid timber, smoke rising from multiple chimneys. Around it clustered barns, storage sheds, a bunkhouse long enough to house an army, and what looked like a separate building for equipment. Fences stretched in every direction, corrals filled with horses and cattle, and even from a distance she could see men working. 20, Rhett had said. It looked like more. Kitchen's that building there, Gage said, pointing to a structure set apart from the rest, close to the main house but not attached. Your cabin's just behind it, small, like the boss said, but it's got a good stove and the roof doesn't leak. High praise, Gage almost smiled. Out here it is. He pulled the wagon up near the kitchen, and Mara climbed down while he unloaded her crates. A few men had stopped what they were doing to watch. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their judgment. Too big, too plain. What the hell was Calder thinking? She didn't have to hear them say it. She'd heard it enough times in her life to know the shape of those thoughts. Mara. She turned. Rhett was crossing the yard toward her, same coat, same purposeful stride. In daylight she could see him more clearly, maybe 40, maybe older, with the kind of weathered face that made age hard to pin down. Not handsome exactly, but striking. The kind of face you remembered. Settled? He asked. Getting there. Good, I'll show you the kitchen. He glanced at the men still watching. And I'll introduce you to the crew at dinner. For now, just focus on getting oriented. He led her into the kitchen, and Mara felt a flutter of something almost like relief. It was a working space. Not fancy, not new, but functional. 2 massive cast-iron stoves dominated one wall, both cold now but clearly well used. Long wooden tables stretched down the center of the room, scarred with years of knife work and scrubbing. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with basics: flour, salt, dried beans, preserved vegetables. A door at the back led to what looked like a cold storage room, and another opened onto the yard. Last cook kept things simple, Rhett said. Beans, bread, meat when we had it. The men didn't complain, but they didn't look forward to meals either. He turned to her. I'm not expecting miracles. Just food that doesn't make them dread sitting down. I can do that. Breakfast's at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 7. You'll have help. A couple of the younger hands rotate through to haul water and firewood, clean up after. But the cooking's on you. Understood. He walked her through the rest of it, where supplies were kept, how to request more, what the budget looked like, which men had dietary restrictions. Not many, but a few. Then he showed her to her cabin. It was small. 1 room, basically, with a bed, a table, a chair, and a stove that looked newer than anything in the kitchen. A window faced east, and the walls were chinked tight against the weather. It's good, Mara said, and meant it. Settle in. Dinner's in 4 hours. I'll expect you to have something ready. 4 hours. She had 4 hours to figure out a kitchen she'd never worked in, with supplies she hadn't inventoried for men who already didn't want her there. I'll be ready. Rhett nodded and left. Mara stood in her new cabin for exactly 30 seconds, letting herself feel the panic. Then she shoved it down, pulled on her coat, and went to work. But the first thing she did was inventory. The kitchen was better stocked than she'd expected. Flour, cornmeal, lard, salt, sugar, dried beans, rice, potatoes, onions, carrots, canned tomatoes, dried apples. A smokehouse out back held several slabs of bacon and a few hams. The cold storage had fresh beef, not fancy cuts, but good enough. She could work with this. She lit both stoves and set water to boil. While it heated, she started pulling ingredients. Beef stew would be safest, filling, familiar, hard to screw up. But safe wouldn't make a statement, and she needed these men to know she wasn't here to coast. She changed her plan. Pot roast. Slow cooked until it fell apart. Potatoes roasted with fat and herbs, carrots glazed with a bit of sugar and butter. Biscuits, real ones, not the dense rocks she'd seen in the supply room. An apple cobbler for after, because men who worked this hard needed something sweet to look forward to. It was ambitious. Maybe too ambitious for a first meal. But Mara had learned a long time ago that if you were going to fail, you might as well fail spectacularly. She worked fast, her hands falling into rhythms she'd practiced 1,000 times. The beef went into the oven, seasoned heavy with salt and pepper and studded with garlic. The potatoes followed, rough cut and tossed with lard and rosemary she found growing in a pot by the window. The carrots simmered on the stove, slowly turning glossy and sweet. The biscuits were last. She made the dough from memory: flour, lard, buttermilk, a pinch of salt, and cut them thick, brushing the tops with butter before they went in. By the time the dinner bell rang, the kitchen smelled like something worth coming home to. The men filed in slowly, in groups of 2 or 3, shedding coats and hats and gloves. Mara stayed in the kitchen, watching through the serving window as they took their seats. They were exactly what Rhett had described: hard men, weathered faces, scarred hands, bodies built for work. Some young, some old, all of them carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from too many hours and not enough rest. None of them looked at her. Rhett came in last, taking a seat at the head of the table. He caught her eye through the window and gave a small nod. "Your move." Mara took a breath and started serving. She brought out the roast first, setting it in the center of the table on a heavy platter. Then the potatoes, the carrots, the biscuits still steaming from the oven. She worked quickly, efficiently, not meeting anyone's eyes. The men didn't speak. They just stared at the food. Finally, one of them, a grizzled man with a gray beard and suspicious eyes, picked up the serving fork and carved himself a slice of beef. He put it on his plate, added potatoes and carrots, took a biscuit. Everyone watched him take the first bite. His expression didn't change, but he reached for seconds. That was the signal. The rest of the table came alive. Hands reaching, plates filling, the sound of forks and knives and low conversation filling the room. Mara retreated to the kitchen and waited. It took 20 minutes for the platters to come back empty. When the young hand who'd been assigned to help her brought them in, he didn't say anything, but he met her eyes for half a second, and something in his face told her she'd done okay. Better than okay. The cobbler sealed it. She brought it out still warm, the top golden and bubbling, and watched as men who'd been ready to leave suddenly found reason to stay. They ate in silence, scraping their bowls clean, and when it was gone, they started to drift out. A few nodded to her as they passed. Not friendly exactly, but acknowledgement. She'd take it. Rhett was the last to leave. He stopped at the kitchen door, hat in hand. "That'll do," he said. It wasn't praise, but it wasn't criticism either. "Tomorrow's breakfast is at 6, Mara said. "I remember." He paused. "They'll warm up. Give it time. I'm not here to be liked." "No," Rhett agreed, "but it helps." He left, and Mara began the long process of cleaning up. Her hands were raw by the time she finished. Her feet ached, her back screamed, but the kitchen was clean, the stoves banked, the prep work done for tomorrow. She stumbled back to her cabin, lit the stove, and collapsed onto the bed without bothering to undress. Sleep came fast, but so did the doubt. What if tonight was a fluke? What if they only tolerated it because it was new? What if tomorrow they remember they don't want you here? She pushed the thoughts away and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would come whether she worried or not. Breakfast was simpler: eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, toast with butter and jam. She made coffee strong enough to strip paint and set it all out at 6 sharp. The men came in quieter this time, less wary. They filled their plates and ate without comment, but when they left, several of them brought their dishes to the kitchen instead of leaving them on the table. Small things, but Mara noticed. Lunch was beef stew, the safe choice she'd skipped the night before. It went over well. Dinner was fried chicken, greens cooked with bacon, cornbread. Better. By the end of the first week, the meals had found a rhythm. Mara learned which men ate fast, which ones lingered, which ones took seconds before anyone else got firsts. She learned that the young hand assigned to help her was named Ben, and he was good at following instructions if you gave them clearly. She learned that the water pump froze if you didn't keep it moving, and that the smokehouse door stuck in cold weather. She learned to tune out the comments, because they came. Not every day, not from everyone, but enough. Surprised she fits through the door. Boss must have been desperate. Wonder how much she eats before we get any. They thought she couldn't hear, or maybe they didn't care. Mara kept cooking, because the thing about kitchens, they didn't lie. You could hide a lot of things, but you couldn't hide whether the food was good. And hers was. The comments got quieter. The compliments, grudging, awkward, half-mumbled, started to outnumber them. And Rhett kept his distance, watching from the edges, never interfering. Until the night, everything changed. It was late, past 10. Mara had stayed to finish prep for the next day's bread, and she was elbow deep in dough when she heard the kitchen door open. She looked up. Rhett stood in the doorway, coat dusted with snow. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. "You didn't." She went back to kneading. "Something you need?" "Just checking in. You settling all right?" "Well enough." He stepped further into the kitchen, glancing around at the clean counters, the organized shelves, the banked stoves. "Place looks different." It was a mess. It was functional. Now it's both. A pause. Then, "The men are talking." Mara's hands stilled. "I don't care what they're saying the food's the best they've had in years." Rhett crossed to the counter, leaning against it. "One of them asked me yesterday if you were planning to stay." "What'd you tell him?" "That it was up to you." Mara shaped the dough into a ball and set it aside to rise. "I'm here as long as you need me." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him then, really looked. He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his expression, curiosity, maybe, or respect. "Why do you care?" "Because good cooks are hard to find, and ones who don't quit when things get hard are even harder." "Things aren't hard yet." "Give it time." He pushed off the counter. "I'm heading to bed. Don't stay up too late." "Mr. Calder?" He stopped. "Why'd you really hire me?" He considered the question, his gaze steady. "Because when I asked around about you, everyone said the same thing. That you were reliable, that you showed up when you said you would, that you didn't make excuses." He paused. "I've hired talented people before. Half of them flaked out when the work got real. I'd rather have someone steady than someone brilliant." "And if I'm neither?" "You are. You just don't know it yet." He left before she could respond. Mara stood alone in the warm kitchen, flour dusting her hands, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe the space where hope could grow, if she let it. She finished her work and walked back to her cabin under a sky heavy with stars. The cold bit at her face, but inside she felt warm. Tomorrow she'd get up before dawn and do it all again, and for the first time in years she didn't dread it. The third week brought snow. Not the gentle kind that dusted the ground and melted by noon. This was the kind that buried fence posts and turned the world into a white void where sky and earth became the same thing. The kind that made men move slower, speak less, and look at the horizon like they were measuring their chances. Mara woke to it before dawn, the silence too heavy to be anything else. She lit her stove and dressed in the dark, pulling on every layer she owned before stepping outside. The cold hit like a fist. She pushed through it, crossing the yard to the kitchen with her head down and her shoulders hunched. The snow was already knee-deep in places, drifted against buildings by wind that hadn't stopped since midnight. Inside, she got the fires going and started coffee. The routine steadied her. Fill the pot, measure the grounds, set it to boil. Outside, the world might be trying to kill them, but in here, there was heat and the promise of food. Ben showed up 20 minutes late, snow-caked on his coat and his face red with cold. "Sorry," he said, stamping his boots. "Drifts are bad." "You make it. That's what counts." Mara handed him a cup of coffee. "Drink that, then start on the fires in the dining hall. We'll need it warm before the men get here." He took the cup with both hands, grateful. "You think they'll all make it in?" "They'll make it. They always do." She wasn't sure she believed that, but Ben needed to hear it. He was young, maybe 19, and still new enough to the ranch that bad weather rattled him. Give him a few more winters and he'd learn, or he'd leave. Most did. Breakfast was oatmeal with brown sugar and dried fruit, bacon fried until it cracked, bread toasted over the stove. Simple, but hot. When you were cold to the bone, hot mattered more than fancy. The men came in by groups, shaking off snow and cursing the weather in voices that didn't carry much heat. They were tired. She could see it in the way they moved, the way they sat down heavy and didn't bother with small talk. Mara filled their bowls and kept the coffee coming. Gage was last in, and he looked worse than the others. His limp, something she'd noticed but never asked about, was more pronounced, and when he lowered himself into his seat, his jaw was tight with pain. She brought him his food and set it down without comment. He glanced up, surprised, then nodded once. She moved on. Rhett didn't come to breakfast. That was unusual. He'd missed meals before, but never without sending word. Mara told herself it didn't matter. He was the boss. He could eat when and where he wanted. But the unease sat in her stomach anyway. After the men cleared out, she sent Ben to check. He came back 10 minutes later, snow-dusted and shaking his head. "Boss is out with a crew. One of the fence lines came down in the night. They're trying to get it back up before the cattle drift." In this weather? He didn't give them a choice. Mara bit back what she wanted to say and went back to work. Lunch was vegetable soup, thick with potatoes and carrots and chunks of beef, and more bread. She made extra, enough for the men working outside, and sent Ben out with a wagon full of thermoses and wrapped sandwiches. "Tell them to eat," she said. "I don't care if they think they don't have time." Ben grinned. "Yes, ma'am." The afternoon dragged. Without the rhythm of meals to mark time, the kitchen felt too quiet. Mara prepped for dinner, checked her stores, reorganized shelves that didn't need organizing. Anything to keep moving. She was pulling a roast from the oven when the door banged open. One of the hands, she thought his name was Curtis, stood in the doorway, breathing hard. "We need help. Rhett's hurt." Mara's hand stilled on the pan. "How bad?" "Bad enough. Horse spooked, threw him into a post. He's conscious, but he's bleeding, and he won't stop working." "Where is he?" "North pasture. We got him to the line shack, but—" "Get a wagon ready. I'm coming with you." "Ma'am, the weather—" "I said get a wagon." Curtis hesitated, then nodded and disappeared. Mara grabbed her coat and the medical kit she'd found in the kitchen her first week. It was basic: bandages, alcohol, needle and thread. But it was better than nothing. She stuffed it into a satchel along with clean towels and a bottle of whiskey from the pantry. The wagon was waiting when she got outside. Curtis was driving, and 2 other men sat in the back, their faces grim. "You sure about this?" Curtis asked as she climbed up. "Just drive." The ride was brutal. The wagon lurched through snow that tried to swallow the wheels, and the wind cut through every layer Mara wore. She held onto the seat and tried not to think about what she'd find when they got there. The line shack was a small structure set in the middle of nowhere. 4 walls and a roof, meant to give men shelter when they were working far from the main ranch. When they pulled up, Mara could see smoke coming from the chimney. Someone had at least gotten a fire going. She climbed down before the wagon fully stopped and pushed through the door. The shack was cramped and dim, lit only by the fire and a single lantern. 4 men stood around a 5th who sat slumped on a bench, his coat off and his shirt dark with blood. Rhett looked up when she entered, and his expression went from surprise to irritation in half a second. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Saving you from yourself." Mara dropped her satchel on the table and crossed to him. "Let me see." "It's fine." "It's not fine. You're bleeding through your shirt. Now let me see or I'll get these men to hold you down." One of the hands made a sound that might have been a laugh. Rhett's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue further. Mara knelt beside him and carefully pulled back the fabric. The wound was on his left side, just below his ribs, a deep gash where he'd hit the post. It was still bleeding, but not gushing. That was something. "You need stitches," she said. "I've had worse." "That doesn't mean you should let this one rot." She looked up at the men standing around. "I need clean water, hot if you can manage it, and more light." They moved to obey, and Mara opened her satchel. She'd stitched wounds before, her own, mostly, and once a neighbor's boy who'd cut his hand on a saw, but never anything quite this deep. She threaded the needle with steady hands and reached for the whiskey. "This is gonna hurt," she said. "I figured." She poured the alcohol over the wound. Rhett hissed through his teeth, but didn't pull away. "Hold still." The first stitch was the hardest. The needle resisted, and she had to push harder than she liked. But once it was through, the rest came easier. She worked quickly, her hands remembering the rhythm even as her stomach churned. Rhett didn't make a sound. His jaw was clenched so tight she thought his teeth might crack, and his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the bench, but he didn't flinch. When she finished, she tied off the thread and sat back. "Done." He let out a breath. "Thanks." "Don't thank me yet. If that gets infected, you'll wish I'd let you bleed out." She cleaned the area around the stitches and wrapped it with clean bandages, then handed him the whiskey. "Drink." He took a long pull and passed it back. "You shouldn't be out here," Mara said quietly. "Not in this weather. Not with that wound. Fence needed fixing. Fence can wait. Cattle can't. They drift in this storm. We lose half the herd." He met her eyes, and his expression was harder than she'd seen it. "I know what I'm doing." "You almost got yourself killed." "Almost doesn't count." She wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him he was an idiot for risking his life over a fence, that dead ranchers couldn't fix anything. But she could see in his face that he'd already made his calculations, already decided what was worth the risk. So instead, she stood and started packing her kit. "You're not going back out there tonight." "The hell I'm not." "The hell you are. You've lost blood, you're half frozen, and if you tear those stitches, you'll bleed out before anyone can get you back here." She turned to the other men. "You tell him, he goes back out there tonight, he's dead by morning." The men exchanged glances. Finally, Gage spoke up. "She's right, boss. Weather's getting worse. We finish up what we can and head back at first light." Rhett looked like he wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was catching up to him. Mara could see it in the way his shoulders sagged, the way his eyes weren't quite focusing right. "Fine," he said finally. "But we're out at dawn." "Dawn," Mara agreed. She looked at Curtis. "Can you get me back to the ranch?" "Not tonight. Roads are too bad. You'll have to wait until morning with the rest of us." She'd been afraid of that. The shack barely fit the 5 men already here. Adding her made it worse. But there wasn't a choice. "All right," she said. "Then someone better start figuring out sleeping arrangements." They ended up drawing straws. 2 men got the bunks, 2 got the floor near the fire, and Rhett got the bench since he was injured. That left Mara with a corner and a single blanket. She didn't complain. Complaining wouldn't make the floor softer or the night shorter. The men settled in as the temperature dropped and the wind picked up outside. Someone divided up the last of the food Mara had sent. Sandwiches and coffee, long since cold but still edible. They ate in silence, too tired for conversation. Mara sat with her back against the wall and watched the fire. The warmth didn't reach her corner, but it was better than nothing. "You shouldn't have come out here." She looked over. Rhett was watching her from the bench, his face half in shadow. "Someone had to," she said. "You could have sent supplies with the men." "And who would have stitched you up?" "I'd have managed. You'd have bled to death or gotten an infection. Either way, you'd be dead inside a week." She pulled the blanket tighter. "You're welcome, by the way." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "You're mouthy when you're cold." "I'm mouthy all the time. You just don't usually notice." This time he did smile, brief but genuine. Then he winced and pressed a hand to his side. "You need to keep pressure off that," Mara said. "Lie down if you can." "I'm fine sitting." "You're stubborn is what you are." "Takes one to know one." She didn't have an argument for that. The night stretched long. The fire burned low, and one of the men got up to add wood. Outside, the storm raged on, battering the shack with wind and snow. Inside, the temperature dropped until Mara could see her breath. She dozed in fits, never quite falling fully asleep. Every time she shifted, the cold found new ways in. Her feet went numb. Her fingers ached. Sometime past midnight, she felt something heavy settle over her shoulders. She opened her eyes. Rhett's coat. He was back on the bench, down to just his shirt and vest, watching the fire. "You'll freeze," Mara said. "I'm closer to the fire." "That's not—" "Just take the damn coat, Mara." She wanted to argue, but the coat was warm and she was so cold her bones hurt. So she pulled it tight around herself and let the exhaustion pull her under. When she woke, gray light was seeping through the gaps in the walls. The fire had burned down to coals, and the men were stirring. Rhett was still on the bench, pale and drawn, but upright. When he saw her awake, he held out his hand for the coat. She gave it back without comment. Outside, the storm had passed. The sky was clear, the sun just beginning to rise, and the world was buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Curtis got the wagon ready while the other men saddled horses. Mara checked Rhett's bandages, still clean, no sign of infection yet, and repacked her kit. "You did good," Rhett said as she worked. "I did what needed doing." "That's what I mean." The ride back to the ranch was slower than the ride out, but easier. The sun was up, the wind had died, and the horses knew the way. Mara sat in the back of the wagon and watched the landscape roll past, white and empty, and beautiful in a way that would kill you if you weren't careful. When they reached the ranch, the men scattered to their tasks. Rhett headed for the main house, moving stiffly but under his own power. Mara went straight to the kitchen. Ben was already there, looking panicked. "Where were you?" "I didn't know what to make for breakfast, and the men were asking, 'It's fine, I'm here now.'" She stripped off her coat and got to work. "Start the coffee. We're behind." They were more than behind. It was past 8, and breakfast should have been done an hour ago. But Mara moved through the kitchen like she hadn't just spent the night half frozen in a line shack. And within 30 minutes, she had eggs, bacon, and biscuits ready to go. The men filed in looking tired and cold. When they saw the food, something in their faces eased. "Heard you patched up the boss last night," one of them said as she set down a platter. "That true?" "Someone had to." "He tell you what happened?" "Didn't need to. Horse spooked. He fell. Not much to tell." The man, she thought his name was Tate, grinned. "You got guts going out there in that weather." "I got a job. Part of that job is keeping you all fed and functional. Can't do that if the boss bleeds out." Tate laughed and went back to his food. But after he left, another hand stopped by the kitchen. Then another. By the time lunch came around, half the crew had found a reason to say something to her. "Thanks for the food, thanks for helping Rhett, thanks for not being useless." They were small things, awkward things, but they were something. That night, after dinner was cleared and the kitchen cleaned, Mara walked back to her cabin and collapsed onto her bed fully clothed. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. Her hands were raw, her feet throbbed. But when she closed her eyes, she didn't feel invisible anymore. The following days settled into a new rhythm. Rhett stayed off his horse for 3 days per Mara's orders and spent most of that time working from the main house. She changed his bandages every morning, and every morning he complained that he was fine. "You're not fine until I say you're fine," she told him on the 3rd day. "You know you're not actually a doctor, right? And you know you're not actually invincible, right?" He didn't have an answer for that. By the end of the week, the wound was healing clean. The stitches held, and there was no sign of infection. Mara counted that as a win. The men had stopped testing her. It wasn't a sudden shift, no single moment where everything changed. But gradually the comments stopped. The sideways looks faded. When she walked into the dining hall, conversations didn't halt. When she asked for something, it got done without argument. She'd earned something out there in the storm. Not friendship, maybe, but respect. And for Mara, that was enough. She started to learn their names, their stories. Gage had been a soldier before he'd been a ranch hand, and the limp was from a bullet that never came out. Tate was saving money to buy his own land someday. Ben had grown up in an orphanage and didn't talk much about anything before the ranch. Curtis was married with 2 kids in town. He went home every Sunday and came back Monday mornings looking tired but content. Another hand, older and quieter than the rest, was called simply Moss. No one seemed to know if that was his first name or last, and he didn't offer. They were hard men, like Rhett had said, but not cruel, just worn down by a life that didn't give much back. Mara understood that. She started tailoring meals to what she learned. Gage couldn't stomach anything too rich, so she made sure there was always a plain option. Tate had a sweet tooth, so she made extra desserts on Fridays. Ben ate like he'd never seen food before, so she made sure the portions were big enough that he could go back for thirds without feeling guilty. Small things, but they mattered. One evening, about a month after the storm, Rhett came to the kitchen after dinner. He'd been doing that more often lately, stopping by under the pretense of checking on supplies or asking about the next day's menu, but really just talking. Mara didn't mind. The kitchen was lonely after everyone left, and Rhett was easy to talk to once you got past the gruffness. "You changed the menu," he said, glancing at the chalkboard she'd started keeping. "Needed variety. We were eating the same rotation every week. The men like it." "I know." He leaned against the counter, watching her work. She was elbow deep in dough again, bread for tomorrow, rolls for the day after. It was meditative work, the kind that let her mind wander. "How'd you learn to cook like this?" Rhett asked. Mara paused, considering the question. "My mother, mostly, before she died, and then just trial and error after that. When you have to feed yourself and you're too poor to waste food, you learn fast." "She teach you to sew, too?" "Why?" "Saw you mending Ben's coat last week. Looked like professional work." "She taught me enough. The rest I figured out." Mara shaped the dough into loaves and set them aside. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious." "You're never just curious." He smiled at that. "Fair. I guess I'm trying to figure you out." "Not much to figure." "I don't know about that." He picked up a scrap of dough and rolled it between his fingers. "You show up here, you don't complain, you work harder than half my crew, and you patched me up in a snowstorm without blinking. That's not nothing." It's just survival. That's all I've ever done. Maybe. But most people who are just surviving don't care about anyone else. You do. Mara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Rhett set down the dough. I'm glad you're here. I don't think I've said that. You pay me. That's enough. It's not, though. She looked up at him then, and for a moment, the air between them felt different, heavier, like there were words trying to form that neither of them knew how to say. Then Ben crashed through the back door, arms full of firewood, and the moment broke. Sorry, Ben said, looking between them. Didn't know you were in here, boss. I was just leaving. Rhett pushed off the counter and headed for the door. He paused on the threshold. Good night, Mara. Good night. After he left, Ben started stacking wood by the stove. You two seem to get along. We work together, that's all. If you say so. Mara threw a towel at him. Focus on the firewood. But after Ben left and she was alone in the kitchen, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Rhett had looked at her, like she was something other than just the cook, like she mattered. It was a dangerous thought, because mattering meant having something to lose, and Mara had spent most of her life making sure she had nothing worth taking. But here, on this ranch, with these men and this work, and this infuriating rancher who kept showing up in her kitchen, she was starting to forget why that had seemed so important. The next morning she woke to shouting, not the usual sounds of men starting their day, but something sharper, urgent. Mara pulled on her coat and boots and ran outside. A crowd had gathered near the main corral. She pushed through and saw Gage on the ground, his face twisted with pain. His leg, the bad one, was bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. What happened? She asked. Horse stepped on him, Curtis said. We need to get him to a doctor. Nearest doctor's in town. That's 3 hours in good weather. We don't have 3 hours. Look at him. Mara looked. Gage's face was gray, his breathing shallow. He was going into shock. She made a decision. Get him inside, carefully, and someone find Rhett. They carried Gage to the bunkhouse and laid him on his cot. Mara sent someone running for her medical kit and knelt beside him. Gage, can you hear me? His eyes focused on her. Hurts. I know. We're going to fix it. She didn't know if that was true, but he needed to hear it. Rhett arrived as she was cutting away Gage's pant leg. He took one look at the injury and swore. That needs a doctor, he said. No time. We have to stabilize it now or he'll lose the leg. Mara looked up at him. I need your help. I'm not a doctor. Neither am I, but we're what he's got. Rhett's jaw tightened, but he nodded. What do you need? Straight planks for a splint, clean cloth for binding, whiskey for pain and sterilization, and 2 men strong enough to hold him still while I set the bone. It took 20 minutes to gather everything. By the time they were ready, Gage was barely conscious. Mara had set broken bones before, chickens mostly, and once a dog, but never on a person, never anything this bad. But there wasn't a choice. She poured whiskey over her hands and the wound, then looked at Rhett. When I say pull, you pull. Don't stop until I say. You sure about this? No, but we're doing it anyway. She positioned her hands on Gage's leg, feeling for the break. It was a clean fracture, at least. That was something. Now, she said. Rhett pulled and Gage screamed. The bone resisted, then slid back into place with a sound Mara would hear in her nightmares. She worked fast, binding the splint tight and wrapping it with cloth. When she was done, Gage had passed out, and Mara's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the bandages. He'll live, she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Rhett put a hand on her shoulder. You did good. We'll see. They stayed with Gage through the night, taking turns watching for fever or signs of infection. By morning, he was awake and lucid, the color back in his face. You saved my leg, he said to Mara. We don't know that yet. I know. Word spread fast. By the time Mara made it to the kitchen for breakfast prep, every man on the ranch knew what she'd done. And when she walked into the dining hall that morning, they stood. All of them. Not clapping, not cheering, just standing. A silent acknowledgement that she was one of them now. Mara's throat tightened. She nodded once and went back to the kitchen before anyone could see her cry. Because this strange, broken family she'd stumbled into was starting to feel like home, and that terrified her more than anything. But home had a way of demanding more than Mara knew how to give. 3 days after Gage's accident, the temperature dropped so low that water froze in the buckets before you could carry it inside. The kind of cold that made your lungs ache with every breath, that turned skin brittle and fingers useless. The men worked in shifts, no one staying outside longer than necessary, and even then they came back looking half dead. Mara kept the kitchen fires roaring and the coffee endless. She made soups thick enough to stand a spoon in, stews that stuck to ribs, bread so fresh it steamed when you tore it open. Anything to fight the cold that wanted to hollow them all out. Rhett spent most of his time in the barns, checking on livestock that couldn't survive exposure. He came in for meals looking exhausted, his face raw from wind, his hands shaking even wrapped around hot coffee. "You need to sleep," Mara told him on the fourth night, after everyone else had cleared out. "I'll sleep when the weather breaks." "You'll collapse before then." "Probably." He didn't look up from his plate. "But the cattle won't care." "The cattle will be fine for one night without you hovering over them." "You don't know that, and you don't know they won't be." Mara sat down across from him, something she'd never done before. The presumption of it made her hesitate, but Rhett didn't tell her to move. "When's the last time you slept more than 2 hours?" He thought about it. "Tuesday, maybe?" "That was 5 days ago." "Like I said, I'll sleep when the weather breaks." Mara wanted to argue, but she could see it wouldn't matter. He'd already made up his mind, and Rhett Calder didn't change his mind for much. "At least eat," she said instead. "All of it. You're no good to anyone if you pass out in a snowdrift." This time he did look up, and there was something in his eyes that might have been amusement. "You know you sound like my mother." "Your mother must have been a smart woman." She was. She also knew better than to waste breath on lost causes. "Then I guess I'm stupider than her." Rhett actually smiled at that, brief but genuine. "Guess so." He finished his meal, every bite, and Mara watched to make sure. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Thanks," he said. "For what?" "For giving a damn." He left before she could respond. Mara sat alone in the warm kitchen, listening to the wind howl outside, and tried not to think about what it meant that his thanks had hit her square in the chest like something physical. The cold snap lasted another week. Then, just when it seemed like winter might never end, the temperature climbed. Not warm, not even close, but enough that men could work full days again without risking frostbite. The relief was almost tangible. Voices got louder at meals. Someone even laughed, a sound so unexpected it made everyone stop and stare. Life crept back in around the edges. Gage was healing slower than any of them liked, but he was healing. The splint came off after 3 weeks, and though his limp was worse than before, he could walk. That was more than they'd hoped for. "You should have been a doctor," he told Mara one morning, catching her outside the kitchen. "Doctors need schooling. I just got lucky." "Luck's a skill when you use it right." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and went back to work. But his words stuck with her. Luck. Was that all this was? A series of fortunate guesses that hadn't blown up in her face yet? She pushed the thought away and focused on the work. There was always work. February came in hard, but March was worse. The snow that had blanketed everything started to melt during the day, then froze again at night. The result was ice, sheets of it, treacherous and unforgiving. Horses slipped, men fell. Everything took twice as long because every step had to be measured. Mara spent more time treating injuries than cooking. Sprained ankles, wrenched shoulders, one man who split his chin open when he went down hard on the ice. She stitched him up at the kitchen table while he cursed and bled all over her good towels. "You're getting too good at this," Curtis said, watching her work. "I'd rather not be." "Yeah, but you are. That counts for something." She tied off the last stitch and stepped back. "Counts for me being tired of sewing people back together." Curtis touched the bandage gingerly. "Better you than letting it rot." He was right, but that didn't make her like it. The injuries kept coming. Nothing major, nothing life-threatening, but enough to wear her down. By the time April finally arrived, Mara felt like she'd aged 10 years. And then the boys showed up. It was late afternoon, the sun already dipping toward the horizon, when one of the hands came running into the kitchen. "There's a kid," he said, breathing hard. "Out by the north fence. He's half frozen." Mara didn't ask questions. She grabbed blankets and followed him out. The boy was maybe 7, maybe younger. Hard to tell with the way his face was pinched from cold and fear. He was dressed in clothes too thin for the weather, his feet wrapped in rags instead of boots, and he was shaking so hard his teeth clattered. "Where did he come from?" Mara asked, already wrapping him in blankets. "Don't know. Found him trying to crawl under the fence." She picked him up, he weighed almost nothing, and carried him back to the kitchen. Inside, she set him by the stove and started checking for frostbite. His fingers were bad, his toes worse, but he'd live. Probably. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The boy stared at her with huge dark eyes and said nothing. "You got a family? Someone looking for you?" Still nothing. Mara tried a few more questions, but the boy either couldn't or wouldn't answer. Finally, she gave up and focused on getting him warm. She made sweet tea with plenty of sugar and held the cup to his lips until he drank. By the time Rhett arrived, the boy had stopped shaking and was staring at the fire with the blank expression of someone who'd seen too much. "Who is he?" Rhett asked. "Don't know. He won't talk." Rhett crouched down to the boy's level, his voice gentle in a way Mara rarely heard. "Hey there. You got a name?" The boy's eyes flicked to him, then away. "It's all right. You're safe here." Rhett glanced at Mara. "He say anything?" "Not a word." "Could be Shoshone. There's a band that moves through the northern range this time of year." He studied the boy's clothes, his face. "Or he could be from anywhere. Hard to say." "What do we do with him?" "Feed him. Keep him warm. Figure the rest out tomorrow." But tomorrow brought problems they hadn't anticipated. Word spread fast that there was a native boy on the ranch. By noon, half the crew had opinions about it. Some said send him back. Others said keep him until someone came looking. A few said nothing good would come from harboring him. The tension built through the day, quiet but heavy. At dinner, it finally broke. "We can't keep him here," one of the hands said. His name was Porter, and he'd always been one of the more vocal men. "You know what'll happen if his people come looking? We'll have a war on our hands." "Or they'll just want their kid back," Curtis countered. "And you think they'll believe we didn't take him? That he just wandered onto our land by accident?" "Maybe he did. Doesn't matter what's true. Matters what they think." Rhett listened without speaking, his expression unreadable. Porter kept going. "I'm not saying hurt the kid. I'm saying put him back where we found him and let him be someone else's problem." "He'll die out there," Mara said quietly. All eyes turned to her. "You don't know that," Porter said. "Yes, I do. He's 7 years old, half-starved, and barely dressed. You put him back out there, he'll freeze or starve or both." She met Porter's eyes. "So if you're suggesting that, just say it plain. Say you'd rather let a child die than risk inconvenience." Porter's face flushed. "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying we got our own to worry about. We can't save every lost kid that wanders through." "We're not talking about every kid. We're talking about one. This one, who's in our kitchen right now." "And what happens when his people come for him? When they see he's here and think we took him? You ready to fight that fight?" "I'm ready to not be the kind of person who throws a child out to die. If you're not, that's on you." The table went silent. Finally, Rhett spoke. "The boy stays. At least until we can figure out where he belongs." "Boss, I said he stays." Rhett's voice was flat, final. "If anyone's got a problem with that, we can talk about it in private. But the decision's made." Porter looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew better. He shoved back from the table and walked out, his plate still half full. A few others followed. Not many, but enough to make a point. Mara felt the fracture, saw it widening. She wanted to say something to fix it, but there was nothing to say. The damage was done. After everyone cleared out, Rhett stayed behind. "You shouldn't have said that," he told her. "Which part?" "The part where you called Porter out in front of everyone. Now he's humiliated and angry. He was suggesting we let a child die. He was voicing a concern that half the crew shares, even if they won't say it. So I should have kept quiet?" "I'm saying you made it personal. That makes it harder to walk back." Mara felt heat rise in her chest. "I'm not walking it back. That boy is staying." "I know. I already said that." Rhett's voice was tired. "But you need to understand that decisions like this have consequences. Porter's been here longer than you. He's got friends. And now they're all wondering if I'm making choices based on what's right or based on what you want." "I didn't ask you to keep him." "You didn't have to. You made your position clear." "And you disagree?" "No. I think you're right, but being right doesn't make this easier. He left her with that, and Mara stood alone in the kitchen, angry and confused, and unsure if she'd just made everything worse. The boy stayed in the kitchen's back room, a small storage space Mara had cleared out and furnished with a cot and blankets. He still wouldn't talk, but he ate when she fed him and followed her around like a shadow when she let him. She started calling him quiet because he needed something to be called, and he didn't correct her. The men who'd sided with Porter avoided the kitchen, the ones who hadn't tried to act normal but couldn't quite manage it. The easy rhythm they'd built over months fractured into something awkward and strained. Mara hated it. Hated that trying to do the right thing had cost her the fragile acceptance she'd earned. But she'd do it again. She knew that much. A week after Quiet arrived, a group of Shoshone riders appeared on the northern ridge. Mara saw them first, from the kitchen window. 5 riders, sitting their horses at the crest of the hill, watching the ranch. She found Rhett in the barn. "We've got visitors." He followed her outside and looked where she pointed. His jaw tightened. "Stay inside." "Like hell." Mara, if they're here for the boy, they'll want to see he's safe. That means me." Rhett looked like he wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. The riders were already descending the hill. They rode into the yard slow and deliberate, their posture wary but not hostile. The man in front was older, his face lined with age and weather, his eyes sharp. Rhett stepped forward, hands visible and empty. "You're welcome here. We mean no harm." The older man studied him for a long moment, then spoke in halting English. "Boy, you have him." It wasn't a question. "We found him by our fence, half frozen. We brought him inside, warmed him, fed him." Rhett's voice was calm, measured. "He's safe." "We see him." Mara stepped forward before Rhett could stop her. "I'll bring him out." She went to the kitchen and found Quiet sitting at the table, drawing patterns in spilled flour. When he saw her face, he went still. "There are people here for you," she said gently. "I think they're your family." The boy's eyes widened, but he didn't move. "It's all right. You're not in trouble. They just want to see you're okay." She held out her hand. After a moment, Quiet took it. They walked out together. The moment the riders saw the boy, the tension in their postures eased. The older man dismounted and crossed to them. He spoke to Quiet in their language, quick and urgent. The boy answered, his voice so quiet Mara almost couldn't hear it. Then the man looked at her. "You care for him." "We all did. He says you gave him food, warmth, medicine for his feet. He needed it." The man studied her face, then Rhett's. Something shifted in his expression, not quite trust, but acknowledgement. "His mother died. Moon before this one. His father, many moons before. He has uncle now, but uncle did not come for him fast. He ran." "We didn't know," Rhett said. "If we had—" "You did right thing." The man placed a hand on Quiet's shoulder. "He is safe. That is what matters." He lifted the boy onto his horse, then mounted behind him. The other riders fell in around them. Before they left, the older man looked back at Mara. "You have kind heart. That is rare thing. I just didn't want him to freeze. Many people want many things. Few do them." He nodded once, a gesture of respect. "You are remembered." Then they rode out, disappearing over the ridge as quickly as they'd come. Mara stood in the yard watching until they were gone. Something tight and painful lodged in her throat. "You did good," Rhett said quietly. "Doesn't feel like it. It never does." That night at dinner, the men who'd walked out came back. Porter sat at his usual spot, ate his food without comment, and left without meeting Mara's eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Over the next few weeks, the fracture slowly closed. Not healed, not forgotten, but patched enough that they could work together again. Mara learned to live with it, learned that doing right didn't always feel good, and that sometimes people forgave you not because they agreed with you, but because they needed the fight to be over. Spring came on slow and tentative, the snow finally retreating, the days stretching longer. The ranch came back to life in increments, green pushing up through dead grass, birds returning, the sound of water running instead of ice cracking. And with the thaw came work. Endless, relentless work. Fences to mend, equipment to repair, fields to prepare for planting. The men worked dawn to dusk, and Mara kept them fed. The kitchen became the center of everything, the one constant in a season of chaos. She fell into bed every night too tired to think and woke every morning to do it again. But somewhere in the exhaustion, she found something else. Satisfaction, maybe? Or purpose? She was needed here, not because she was the only option, but because she was good at what she did. That mattered more than she'd expected. One evening in late April, Rhett came to the kitchen after everyone else had left. He'd been doing that more often lately, helping wash dishes or prep for the next day, not talking much, but just being there. Mara had stopped questioning it. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked, scrubbing a pot. "Next?" "After this. After the ranch, after winter, after all of it." Mara considered the question. "Not really. I'm not good at thinking past tomorrow." "Why not?" "Because tomorrow's all I've ever been able to count on." She dried a plate and set it aside. "Planning for more than that feels like asking for disappointment. That's a hell of a way to live. It's kept me alive this long." Rhett was quiet for a moment, his hands still in the soapy water. "You know you could stay here. Permanent. If you wanted." Mara's hands stilled. "I thought I already was." "I mean beyond just work. Make this your home. Build something here." "I'm not looking to build anything. Maybe you should be." She turned to look at him. "Why?" "Because you're good at it. Because the men respect you. Because—" He stopped, searching for words. "Because you matter here. And I think you know that." Mara felt something shift in her chest, something dangerous and terrifying. Mattering's just another word for having something to lose? Maybe, but it's also another word for having something worth keeping. She didn't know how to answer that, didn't know if she wanted to. So instead, she went back to drying dishes, and Rhett went back to washing them, and the silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. But it was there, and that was enough. For now. May brought heat that felt wrong after months of cold, the kind that sat heavy on your shoulders and made everything harder than it needed to be. The men stripped down to shirt sleeves and still came back from the fields looking wrung out. Mara adjusted the menu accordingly. Cold meals when she could manage it, lighter fare, more water. She kept pitchers of switchel in the cold storage and made sure Ben hauled them out to the crews working distant pastures. The rhythm should have been comfortable by now. 6 months she'd been here, 6 months of the same patterns, the same faces, the same work. But something had shifted after that night with Rhett in the kitchen, and Mara couldn't quite put her finger on what. He was around more. Not obviously, not in a way anyone else would notice. But Mara did. He'd find reasons to check in, to ask questions that didn't need asking, to linger over coffee when the meal was done. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She was good at lying to herself. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday. Ben showed up to help with breakfast, looking pale and shaky. Mara took one look at him and pointed to a chair. "Sit." "I'm fine." "You look like death. Sit." He sat. Within minutes, he was running for the door to be sick. By noon, 3 more men were down with the same symptoms. By evening, it was 7. Mara stood in the kitchen trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The food had been fine yesterday. She was sure of it. She'd tasted everything herself, checked the storage, made sure nothing was spoiled, but something had gotten into them. Rhett came in looking grim. How many? 7 confirmed, maybe more. What caused it? I don't know. The admission tasted like failure. Everything was clean, everything was cooked through. I don't understand. Anyone die from bad food? Not yet, but they're bad off. High fevers, can't keep anything down. Rhett scrubbed a hand over his face. We need a doctor. Nearest one's in town, and he won't come out here, not for this. Then we handle it ourselves. He met her eyes. You handled Gage. You can handle this. Gage was one man with a broken leg. This is different. You're still the best chance they've got. Mara wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. More men were getting sick by the hour, and sitting around debating capabilities wouldn't help any of them. She sent Ben, who'd recovered enough to stand, to gather supplies. Willow bark for fever, chamomile for the stomach, anything she could think of that might help. Then she started going through the kitchen methodically, looking for the source. It took 3 hours to find it, the water barrel. Someone had refilled it from the creek instead of the well, and something in that water had turned. Not enough to taste, not enough to see, but enough to sicken anyone who drank it. "Who filled this?" she asked when Rhett came back. He looked at the barrel, then at her. "Could have been anyone. We've all done it." "Well, someone did it wrong, and now half your crew is flat on their backs. Can you fix them?" "I can try." She spent the next 3 days moving between the bunkhouse and the kitchen, brewing remedies, forcing liquids down throats, changing sweat-soaked sheets. The men were miserable, delirious with fever, and some of them fought her when she tried to help. "Let me die," one of them moaned when she brought him water. "You're not dying. You're just dramatic. Drink." He drank. By the 4th day, the fevers started breaking. By the 5th, men were sitting up. By the end of the week, most of them were back on their feet, weak and shaky, but alive. Porter was one of the last to recover. When he finally made it back to the kitchen for a meal, he stopped by on his way out. "Thanks," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "For what?" "For not letting me die just because I'm an ass." Mara almost smiled. "You're welcome." He nodded and left. It wasn't friendship, but it was something closer than they'd been before. The sickness changed things in ways Mara hadn't expected. The men who'd been on the fence about her came down solidly on her side. The ones who'd already accepted her started treating her less like the cook and more like something else. Something closer to family. Tate started bringing her firewood without being asked. Curtis fixed the squeaky hinge on her cabin door. Even Moss, who barely spoke to anyone, nodded to her when they passed in the yard. Small gestures, but they added up. Rhett noticed. "You've won them over." "I just kept them from dying. That's not winning anyone over." "That's exactly what it is." He was helping her haul supplies from the storage shed, and his voice was quiet enough that no one else could hear. "Half those men have worked ranches their whole lives, and I guarantee you no cook's ever done for them what you just did. Any cook would have. No, they wouldn't." He set down the crate he was carrying and turned to face her. "Most people do the minimum required and call it good. You don't know how to do that." Mara didn't know what to say to that, so she picked up her own crate and kept walking. But his words stayed with her. June came in hot and dry. The grass turned brown, the creek ran low, and tempers got short. Water became precious, rationed carefully, and arguments broke out over who got access to what. Mara kept her head down and focused on keeping the kitchen running. It was harder now with supplies running low and the heat making everything spoil faster. She had to get creative, stretching what they had, making meals out of ingredients that shouldn't have worked together, but somehow did. The men didn't complain. If anything, they seemed impressed. "How'd you make that?" Curtis asked one night after finishing a dish that was mostly beans and hope. "Trade secret. Seriously, that was good." "Thanks." "No, I mean it. My wife's been cooking for 20 years, and I don't think she could pull off half of what you do." Mara felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the kitchen. "Your wife probably has better ingredients to work with." "Maybe. But she doesn't have your instinct." After he left, Mara stood alone in the kitchen and let herself feel it. Pride. Real, honest pride in work she'd done and done well. It had been a long time since she'd felt that. The heat broke in early July with a storm that came out of nowhere. One minute the sky was clear, the next it was black and roiling, and the wind was tearing at anything not nailed down. The men scrambled to secure livestock and equipment while Mara battened down the kitchen. She'd just gotten the last shutter closed when she heard shouting. She ran outside and saw smoke rising from the equipment shed. Lightning strike. The whole structure was going up, flames leaping 20 feet high, and men were running toward it with buckets that wouldn't make a damn bit of difference. "Get back!" Rhett was shouting, trying to pull men away from the heat. "It's gone! Let it burn!" But one of the hands, a young kid named Danny, who couldn't have been more than 16, was running toward the shed instead of away from it. "The horses!" he was screaming. "They're still in the barn!" The barn was too close to the equipment shed. If the fire spread, and it would, the horses would burn alive. Mara didn't think. She just ran. She got to the barn ahead of Danny and threw open the doors. Inside, the horses were screaming, panicked by smoke and flame. She grabbed the first halter she could reach and started leading horses out, one by one, her lungs burning from smoke, her eyes streaming. Danny was right behind her, doing the same. They got 6 out before the heat became unbearable. 7. 8. How many more? Mara shouted over the roar of the fire. 2! Back corner! She pushed deeper into the barn, the smoke so thick now she could barely see. Her hand found a halter, then another. She got both horses moving toward the door just as part of the roof collapsed behind her. The crash sent sparks everywhere. The horses bolted, dragging Mara with them, and she lost her footing and went down hard. She felt the impact more than saw it. Someone grabbing her arm, hauling her up, pulling her toward the door. Then they were outside and she was on the ground coughing so hard she thought she'd crack a rib. "Breathe," Rhett's voice, rough and urgent. "Just breathe." She tried. Her lungs didn't want to cooperate. "Is she all right?" That was Curtis. "She will be. Get her some water." Mara managed to sit up, still coughing, her throat raw. Around her, men were leading horses away from the fire, beating out embers that had landed on the grass, doing damage control. The equipment shed was gone, nothing but a smoking shell. But the barn had survived, and all the horses were out. "What the hell were you thinking?" Rhett's voice was tight with something that might have been anger or fear or both. "The horses could have been replaced. You can't." Mara stared at him. "They would have burned. So would you have." "But I didn't." He made a sound halfway between a laugh and something darker. "You're going to kill me. You know that?" "Didn't know you cared." "Of course I care, you stubborn—" He stopped, jaw working, then seemed to make a decision. "We're talking about this later." He stalked off before she could respond. Curtis handed her a cup of water. "He's right, you know. That was stupid." "Yeah, I know. But brave." "Bravery and stupidity look pretty similar from where I'm sitting." Curtis smiled. "Usually do." The fire burned itself out by midnight. The equipment shed was a total loss, along with most of the tools stored inside. But the barn stood, the horses were safe, and no one had died. They'd rebuild. They always did. Mara went back to her cabin covered in soot and smelling like smoke. She stripped off her ruined clothes, washed as best she could with the water she had, and fell into bed. Sleep didn't come. Instead, she kept seeing the flames, feeling the heat, hearing the horses scream. Kept thinking about how close it had been, how easily things could have gone wrong. She was still awake when someone knocked on her door. She wrapped a blanket around herself and answered it. Rhett stood on her porch, still in his smoke-stained clothes, looking as tired as she felt. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside. He crossed to the window and stood looking out at nothing, his back to her. "I thought you were dead. When I saw you go down in that barn, I thought, but I'm not. That's not the point." He turned to face her. "You can't keep doing this. Throwing yourself into danger because someone has to. Someone did have to. Let it be someone else." "Why?" "Because—" He stopped, frustration clear on his face. "Because you matter. To this ranch, to the men, to—" Another pause. "To me." The words hung in the air between them. Mara's chest felt tight. "Rhett, I know. I know you didn't come here looking for this. Neither did I. But somewhere along the way it happened anyway, and I'm done pretending it didn't." She should have been surprised, should have felt something other than this strange sense of inevitability, like she'd been walking toward this moment since the day she'd arrived. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "Do what?" "Whatever this is. I've never—" She struggled for words. "No one's ever wanted me like that. I don't know what to do with it." Rhett crossed the room until he was standing in front of her. "You don't have to do anything. Just don't run from it." "I'm not good at staying. You've been here 6 months. That's more staying than running." He had a point. "What if I'm not what you think I am?" The question came out smaller than she meant it. "What do you think you are?" "I don't know. Someone better than I actually am." "Mara." He said her name like it meant something. "I've watched you work yourself half to death keeping this place running. I've seen you stitch up injured men, save dying horses, take in lost kids, and face down my entire crew without blinking. I know exactly who you are." "And that doesn't scare you?" "Terrifies me, but I'm doing it anyway." She didn't know who moved first. Maybe both of them. But suddenly the space between them was gone, and he was kissing her like she was something precious and terrifying all at once. Mara had been kissed before. Fumbling attempts in her youth that had gone nowhere left her feeling more awkward than wanted. This was different. This was deliberate and sure and full of all the things neither of them knew how to say. When they finally pulled apart, Rhett rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said. "Not just for the work. For this. For us. You're asking a lot." "I know. What if I can't? Then I'll ask again tomorrow, and the day after that, until you believe me when I say you belong here." Mara felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept sealed for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Hope, maybe, or possibility, or just the terrifying knowledge that she wanted this more than she'd wanted anything in years. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'll stay." His smile was the best thing she'd seen in months. He kissed her again, slower this time, and Mara let herself fall into it. Let herself believe, just for a moment, that this could be real. When he finally left, it was nearly dawn. Mara stood at her window watching the sky lighten and tried to quiet the voice in her head that said this was too good to last. Because good things didn't happen to people like her. And when they did, they never stayed. The next few weeks passed in a blur of heat and work and stolen moments with Rhett that felt like a secret, even though half the ranch probably knew. The men didn't comment. A few knowing looks, a couple of smiles that said they'd figured it out, but no one said anything directly. Mara was grateful for that. Things were good. Better than good. The ranch was running smoothly, the men were healthy, the summer crops were coming in strong. For the first time in her life, Mara felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That should have been her first warning. Because nothing good lasted, not in her experience. The sickness started small, one man complaining of stomach cramps, then another, then 3 more. Mara's first thought was the water again, but she'd been vigilant about that since the last outbreak. Every barrel checked, every source verified. It wasn't the water. By the second day, 8 men were down. By the third, 12. And these symptoms were different, worse. High fevers, violent vomiting, weakness so profound they could barely stand. Mara worked around the clock, trying to keep them hydrated, trying to bring the fevers down, trying everything she could think of. Nothing worked. On the 4th day, she stood in the kitchen, staring at the food stores and felt ice in her veins. The flour. The last shipment of flour. She'd used it for bread 3 days ago. The same bread every sick man had eaten. She grabbed a handful and examined it closely. There, barely visible, dark specks mixed in with the white. Ergot. A fungus that grew on grain, poisonous if consumed, and she'd just fed it to half the crew. Her legs went weak. She sat down hard, the flour spilling from her hand. This was her fault. Every man lying in that bunkhouse delirious with fever, everyone fighting for their lives. Her fault. The door opened. Rhett took one look at her face and crossed the room. "What is it?" She couldn't speak, just pointed at the flour scattered on the table. He looked, then understood. "Contaminated?" "Ergot. I didn't see it. I should have checked. Should have been more careful, but I didn't, and now—" Her voice cracked. "They're dying because of me." "We don't know that they're dying." "They're not getting better." Rhett crouched in front of her, forcing her to meet his eyes. "This wasn't your fault. You didn't know." "I should have." "You're not responsible for checking every grain of flour that comes onto this ranch. That's on the supplier. I'm responsible for what I feed them. That's my job, and I failed." She waited for him to agree, to tell her she was right, that she'd let everyone down, that she wasn't good enough for this. Instead, he said, "Then we fix it, together. What do they need?" The question startled her out of her spiral. "What? What do the men need to recover? What can we do?" Mara's mind started working again, pushing past the guilt. Activated charcoal to absorb the toxins, fluids to flush their systems, time for their bodies to process it. "We have charcoal?" "We can make it. Burn willow wood, grind it fine, mix it with water." "Then that's what we do." She looked at him. "You still want me here? After this? Are you serious right now? I poisoned your crew. You fed them contaminated flour you had no way of knowing was contaminated. That's different." His voice was firm. "And yes, I still want you here. Now get up. We've got work to do." So they worked. Mara made charcoal while Rhett kept the men hydrated. They worked through the night and into the next day, trading off sleep in shifts, neither willing to stop while men were suffering. Slowly, agonizingly, it started to work. The fevers came down, the vomiting stopped. Men who'd been too weak to lift their heads started sitting up. Not all of them recovered at the same rate. Some bounced back within days. Others took weeks. But none of them died. When the last man was finally out of danger, Mara collapsed. Not dramatically, just sat down in the kitchen one morning and couldn't make herself get back up. Rhett found her there an hour later. "When's the last time you slept?" he asked. "I don't remember." "That's what I thought." He held out his hand. "Come on. I have to start breakfast. Curtis is handling it. Come on." She let him pull her to her feet and lead her to her cabin. He got her into bed, pulled the blankets up, and sat down in the chair by the window. "You don't have to stay," Mara said. "I know. I'm fine. You're exhausted. There's a difference." She wanted to argue, but her eyes were already closing. The last thing she remembered was Rhett's voice, quiet and steady. "I've got you. Rest." So she did. When she woke, it was dark outside. Rhett was still in the chair, asleep with his head tipped back and his arms crossed. Mara watched him for a long moment, this man who'd somehow become the center of her world without her quite noticing. Then she got up, crossed the room, and shook his shoulder gently. He woke with a start. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, but you should go sleep in an actual bed." "I'm fine here." "Rhett." All right. He stood, stretching out the kinks. "You feeling better?" "Yeah." He studied her face. "You still blaming yourself?" "A little." "That's honest, at least." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "For what it's worth, none of the men blame you. They know it wasn't your fault." "How do you know?" "Because I asked them, every single one." He smiled slightly. "You know what they said?" "What?" "That if it hadn't been for you, they'd all be dead. That you saved them even though you were the one who felt responsible. That takes a special kind of person." Mara felt her throat tighten. "I don't feel special." "You never do. That's part of what makes you so damn stubborn." He opened the door. "Get some more sleep. I'll see you in the morning." After he left, Mara lay back down and stared at the ceiling. The guilt hadn't disappeared, probably never would completely, but underneath it, something else was growing. The knowledge that she'd faced the worst thing she could imagine, being responsible for hurting the people who'd come to rely on her, and survived it. More than survived. She'd fixed it. That had to count for something. August came in with a vengeance, the kind of heat that made you question every decision that had led you to this particular piece of earth. The ranch slowed down in self-defense, work shifting to early mornings and late evenings, the middle of the day too brutal for anything but shade and stillness. Mara adjusted again. Cold suppers became the norm. Sliced meat, fresh vegetables from the garden she'd started behind the kitchen, bread that didn't require heating the entire building to bake. The men appreciated it, though they'd never say so directly. They just kept showing up, kept eating, kept working. Life found its rhythm again after the poisoning. It took time, longer than Mara would have liked, but eventually the tension that had settled over everything after the contaminated flour began to ease. The men recovered fully, one by one, and if some of them moved a little slower than before, at least they were moving. Porter was one of the last to regain his full strength. He'd been hit harder than most, and for a while Mara had been genuinely afraid they'd lose him. But he was stubborn, and stubborn kept people alive when nothing else would. He sought her out one evening after dinner, catching her as she was hauling water for the morning. "Let me get that," he said, taking the bucket from her hands before she could protest. "I can manage." "I know you can. Doesn't mean you should have to." He filled the bucket and set it by the door. "I wanted to say something." Mara braced herself. "All right. I was wrong about you. When you first got here, I thought Rhett had lost his mind hiring a woman. Thought you'd be more trouble than you were worth." He met her eyes. "I was wrong. You're probably the best thing that's happened to this place in years." The admission clearly cost him something. Porter wasn't the kind of man who said things like that easily. "Thanks," Mara said, because she didn't know what else to say. "The flower thing, that wasn't your fault. I know you think it was, but it wasn't. Could have happened to anyone. But it happened to me. And you fixed it. That's what matters. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the conversation, but determined to finish it. Anyway, just wanted you to know, you're one of us now, for whatever that's worth. He left before she could respond, and Mara stood in the cooling evening air, feeling like she'd just been handed something precious and fragile. Acceptance. Real acceptance. Not grudging or conditional, but the kind that came from being tested and not found wanting. She'd never had that before. The next week brought visitors. A supply wagon from town driven by a merchant Mara had met a few times before. He was a round man with a friendly face and a tendency to talk too much, but he brought quality goods and charged fair prices, so Rhett kept doing business with him. This time he brought more than supplies. Heard about what happened here, he said to Mara as she was checking the delivery. The sickness must have been rough. We managed, I'll bet. Also heard it was you that pulled them through. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. There's talk in town about a woman up at Calder Ridge who can cure just about anything. People are calling you a healer. Mara nearly laughed. I'm a cook. Maybe so, but that's not what they're saying. He handed her a list. Got a request here. Woman in town, her daughter's been sick for weeks. Doctors can't figure it out. She asked if I'd see if you could come take a look. I'm not a doctor. Didn't say you were, but you're something, and right now that's more than she's got. Mara looked at the list, at the woman's name written in desperate, shaky handwriting. Sarah Mitchell. Below it, please, she's all I have. I can't just leave, Mara said. I have work here. Take a day. One day. Rhett can spare you that long. She wanted to say no. Wanted to explain that whatever people thought she wasn't. That she'd gotten lucky a few times and people had mistaken luck for skill. But she looked at those words again, she's all I have, and thought about what it felt like to have nothing, to be nothing. I'll ask Rhett, she said finally. Rhett said yes before she'd even finished explaining. Of course you should go, he said. If you can help, you should. What if I can't? Then at least you tried. That's more than most people would do. So the next morning, Mara climbed into the merchant's wagon with her medical kit and a stomach full of doubt. The ride to town took 3 hours. The merchant talked the entire way, about weather, about politics, about his wife's sister's new baby. Mara let the words wash over her without really listening, her mind on what waited at the other end. Sarah Mitchell's house was small but well kept, on the edge of town where the buildings started giving way to open land. The woman who answered the door looked like she hadn't slept in days. You came, she said, and the relief in her voice made Mara's chest tight. I'll do what I can. The daughter, Emma, maybe 10 years old, was in bed, pale and listless. She'd been sick for 3 weeks, her mother explained. Started with fever and vomiting, then progressed to weakness so severe she couldn't stand. 2 different doctors had looked at her and prescribed rest and fluids, but nothing was working. Mara sat beside the bed and started asking questions. What had Emma eaten? Where had she been? Had anything changed in the house recently? It took an hour of gentle probing before the answer emerged. A new well. The family had dug a new well 2 months ago, and Emma had been drinking from it daily. Show me, Mara said. The well was in the backyard, newly constructed and seemingly clean, but when Mara drew up a bucket and examined the water closely, she saw the faint oily sheen on the surface, runoff from something, seeping into the groundwater. Stop drinking from this, she told Sarah. Use the old well, or get water from town. This one's contaminated. But we just dug it. I don't care how new it is. It's making her sick. She went back inside and made Emma drink water treated with charcoal, the same remedy she'd used on the ranch. Then she showed Sarah how to make it herself, how to monitor Emma's symptoms, what to watch for. She'll get better, Mara said, but it'll take time. Her body needs to clear the toxins. Sarah grabbed her hand. Thank you. The doctors said there was nothing more they could do, that I just had to wait and see. Sometimes waiting's the right answer, but not when the cause is still poisoning her. Mara squeezed her hand back. She'll be all right. When Mara stood to leave, Sarah pressed a small cloth bag into her hands. It's not much, just some eggs and butter, but I needed to give you something. You don't have to pay me. I know, but let me give you this anyway, please. Mara took the bag. Thank you. On the porch, Sarah caught her arm one more time. What you did? Most people wouldn't have bothered. Wouldn't have come all this way for people they don't know. I know what it's like to need help and not get it, Mara said quietly. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. The ride back to the ranch felt different. Lighter, somehow, despite the exhaustion settling into her bones. You figured it out, the merchant said, grinning. Didn't you? Maybe. That's going to be all over town by tomorrow. You know that, right? Mara sighed. Probably. Could be good for business, people knowing there's someone up at Calder Ridge who can help with things the doctors can't. I'm not trying to start a business. I'm trying to keep a ranch fed. Can't you do both? She didn't have an answer for that. When she got back to the ranch, Rhett was waiting. How'd it go? Fine, she'll be okay. You figure out what was wrong? Contaminated well water. Simple fix once I knew what to look for. She climbed down from the wagon, her back protesting every movement. How are things here? Quiet. Curtis handled dinner. Men are still alive, so I guess he did all right. Mara smiled despite herself. High praise. You look exhausted. I am exhausted. Then go rest. You've done enough for one day. But she didn't rest. She went to the kitchen and started prep for tomorrow because the work didn't stop just because she was tired. Rhett followed her in. Mara, I'm fine. You're running yourself into the ground. I'm doing my job. Your job doesn't require you to solve every problem that crosses your path. She turned to face him. What am I supposed to do? Ignore people who need help? I'm not saying ignore them. I'm saying you don't have to carry everything alone. I've been carrying things alone my entire life. I don't know how else to do it. Rhett crossed the room and took her hands, stilling them. That's the whole point. You don't have to anymore. You've got me. You've got the men. You've got this place. We're not going anywhere. Mara wanted to believe him, but belief required trust, and trust required letting go of the armor she'd worn so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. What if I can't do it? She asked quietly. What if I don't know how to let people in? Then we'll figure it out together, same way we figure out everything else. He kissed her forehead, gentle and sure, and something in Mara's chest unclenched. Maybe he was right. Maybe she didn't have to do this alone. Maybe that was the whole point. The rest of August passed in a blur of work and heat and small moments that added up to something bigger. Rhett started spending more time at her cabin in the evenings, helping with whatever needed doing, talking about nothing and everything. The men stopped pretending they didn't know about them and started making jokes that were mostly good-natured. Mara found herself laughing more. Sleeping better, looking forward to tomorrow instead of just surviving today. It should have scared her, would have, a year ago, but now it just felt right. September brought cooler weather and the first hints of fall. The leaves started turning, the air got crisp at night, and the work shifted toward preparing for winter. Mara had been through one winter here already. She knew what was coming. This time, she'd be ready. She spent weeks preserving food, stocking the cold storage, making sure they had enough of everything to last through the months when the road would be impassable. The men helped without being asked, hauling supplies, fixing equipment, doing whatever needed doing. They were a team now, a real one. One evening in late September, Mara was in the kitchen working on inventory when Rhett came in looking troubled. What's wrong? She asked. Got a letter from town. The merchant who brought you to see that girl? He's been spreading word about what you did. I figured he would. There are people asking if you'd be willing to come to town, set up something regular, a day a week where people could come see you for help. Mara set down her pencil. I'm not a doctor. They know that. They don't care. They just want someone who'll listen and try to help instead of charging them money they don't have and telling them there's nothing to be done. What do you think I should do? I think it's your choice. Rhett leaned against the counter. But I also think you're good at this, at helping people. And if there's a need for it, maybe that's worth considering. What about the ranch? The ranch will be fine. We'll make it work. Mara thought about Sarah Mitchell's desperate handwriting, about Emma's pale face, about all the people out there who needed help and couldn't get it. One day a week, she said. That's all I can manage. One day's more than they had before. So she started going to town every Tuesday. At first it was just a handful of people, mostly women, mostly with sick children or elderly parents the doctors had given up on. Mara didn't cure everyone. couldn't. But she listened, and she tried, and more often than not, she found something the doctors had missed. A rash that was actually an allergic reaction. A persistent cough caused by mold in the walls. A child who wasn't sick at all, just malnourished. Simple things. But they mattered. The first few weeks were overwhelming. Mara would come back to the ranch exhausted, her mind spinning with all the people she'd seen, all the problems she couldn't solve. Rhett would find her in the kitchen late at night, unable to sleep, worrying about whether she'd given the right advice. "You can't save everyone," he told her one night. "I know that." "Do you? Because you're acting like every person who doesn't get better is a personal failure. Isn't it?" "No, it's just life. People get sick. People die. You do what you can, and sometimes that's not enough. That doesn't make you a failure." Mara knew he was right, but knowing something and feeling it were different things. Still, she kept going back, kept trying. And slowly she started to see patterns, started to understand that healing wasn't just about fixing bodies. It was about giving people hope, about making them feel seen and heard when the rest of the world had written them off. That she could do. Word spread further. People started coming from neighboring towns. The 1 day a week stretched longer as more people showed up. Mara started bringing Curtis with her to help manage the crowd, to keep things organized, to make sure she actually ate something between patients. "You're building something here," Curtis told her one Tuesday afternoon. "You know that, right?" "I'm just helping people. That's what building something looks like." By October, the ranch had found a new equilibrium. Mara spent Tuesdays in town and the rest of the week at Calder Ridge, and somehow both places thrived. The men stepped up to cover the work she couldn't do, and in return she made sure they were fed and healthy and taken care of. It worked because everyone made it work. One Sunday afternoon, Mara was working in the garden when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see a group of riders, 5 of them, led by the older Shoshone man who'd come for quiet months before. She stood slowly, wiping dirt from her hands, trying to read their intent. The man dismounted and approached with his hands visible. "We come in peace." "You're welcome here," Mara said. "The boy, he speaks of you, says you gave him food when he was cold, warmth when he was dying. We all did. He says you fought for him, when others wanted him gone." Mara didn't know what to say to that. The man reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out something wrapped in leather. He held it out to her. A gift for kindness shown. Mara unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a necklace, beautifully crafted, with beads and small carved stones arranged in an intricate pattern. "I can't accept this," she said. "It's too much. It is payment for debt owed." He placed it in her hands. "You saved our child. That is worth more than stones. He was just a boy who needed help." "Yes, and you helped when help was needed. That is rare thing." He nodded to her. "You are welcome in our camp, always. If you need, we will come." After they left, Mara stood in the garden holding the necklace and trying not to cry. Rhett found her there an hour later. "What happened?" She told him. He looked at the necklace, then at her. "You're amazing. You know that?" "I just did what anyone would." "No, most people wouldn't. That's the point." He pulled her close. "You see people. Really see them. That's a gift." "It doesn't feel like a gift. It just feels like paying attention." "Same thing." That night, Mara put the necklace in a box in her cabin and tried to understand what had just happened. She'd helped a child, that was all. But somehow it had mattered more than she'd realized. Maybe that was the lesson. That small acts of kindness rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict or measure. That doing the right thing wasn't about grand gestures. It was about showing up when it mattered and doing what needed to be done. She was still learning that, still learning to believe she was capable of mattering, but she was getting there. November came in cold and early. The first snow fell before Halloween, and by Thanksgiving the ground was frozen solid. The ranch settled into winter mode. Shorter days, longer nights, work focused on keeping animals alive and people warm. Mara's Tuesday trips to town became harder. The roads were treacherous, and more than once they had to turn back because the weather was too dangerous. But she kept trying, kept going when she could, because people were counting on her. One particularly brutal Tuesday, she made it to town only to find a line of people waiting that stretched down the block. Women with sick children, men with injuries that hadn't healed right, elderly folks who'd been suffering for months with ailments no one could name. She saw them all. Every single one. Worked from dawn until well past dark, until her hands were shaking with exhaustion and her voice was hoarse from talking. Curtis finally put his foot down. "We're leaving, now, before you collapse. There are still people. They'll be here next week. You won't be any good to them if you work yourself to death." On the ride back, Mara stared out at the dark landscape and felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. Too many people, too much need, too much expectation that she couldn't possibly live up to. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she said quietly. Curtis didn't answer right away. Then, "You remember when you first got to the ranch? How the men treated you?" "Yeah." "You could have quit then. Could have walked away and no one would have blamed you. But you didn't. You stayed. You proved yourself. And now those same men would do anything for you." "What's your point?" "My point is, you've never known how to quit. It's not in you. So yeah, this is hard. It's supposed to be hard. But you'll figure it out, because that's what you do." Mara wanted to believe him, wanted to think she was strong enough to handle all of this. But sometimes wanting wasn't enough. When they got back to the ranch, Rhett took one look at her and carried her straight to bed. "Sleep," he ordered. "Everything else can wait." "But the kitchen is being handled. Sleep." She did. For 14 hours straight, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that came from complete exhaustion. When she woke, it was late afternoon. She could hear voices outside, the normal sounds of the ranch at work. Everything had kept going without her. That should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like proof that she wasn't as necessary as she'd thought. She found Rhett in the barn checking on a mare that was close to foaling. "You're up," he said. "You didn't wake me. You needed sleep more than you needed to be awake." He straightened, brushing hay from his hands. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About you running yourself into the ground trying to be everything to everyone. About how you can't keep going like this." Mara felt defensive. "I'm fine." "You're not. You're exhausted. You're spread too thin, and if you don't slow down, you're going to break. People need help." "I know, but you can't help anyone if you destroy yourself in the process." He moved closer. "I'm not saying stop. I'm saying be smarter about it. Set limits. Ask for help. Let other people carry some of the weight." "I don't know how to do that." "Then learn, because I can't watch you kill yourself trying to save the world." His words hit harder than she expected. "You think that's what I'm doing?" "I think you spent so long believing you didn't matter that now you're trying to make up for it by mattering to everyone. And that's not sustainable." Mara felt tears prick her eyes. "What if I stop and people die because I wasn't there?" "Then they die. And that's terrible, and it's not fair, but it's also not your fault." Rhett took her hands. "You're one person, Mara. One person. You can't fix everything, and you shouldn't have to." She knew he was right. Hated that he was right. But knowing didn't make it easier to accept. "I'll try," she said finally. "To do better. To not take on so much. That's all I'm asking." That night they had the conversation she'd been avoiding. About limits. About what she could realistically handle. About bringing in help. Training others to do some of the work she'd been doing alone. It felt like failure. Like admitting she wasn't good enough. But Rhett was patient. He walked her through it. Helped her see that asking for help wasn't weakness. It was the only way to make the work sustainable. By the time they were done, Mara had agreed to limit her Tuesday sessions to 4 hours. To train 2 women in town to handle basic cases. To focus on the most urgent needs and let go of trying to solve everything. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. December brought the hardest cold they'd seen in years. The kind that made metal brittle and water freeze in pipes before you could draw it. The ranch hunched down and endured, men and animals alike just trying to survive until spring. Mara's world narrowed to the essentials. Keep the kitchen running, keep the men fed, keep everyone alive. On Christmas Eve, Rhett found her in the kitchen, making bread for the next day. "Come here," he said. "I'm almost done. Now." She followed him outside. The night was clear and brutally cold, stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. "What are we doing out here?" Mara asked, already shivering. "This." Rhett dropped to one knee. Mara's breath caught. "I know we've talked about this," he said, "about making things official, but I wanted to do it right, wanted to ask properly." He pulled a ring from his pocket, simple, silver, with a small stone that caught the starlight. "Marry me, Mara. Make this permanent. Make us real." She looked down at him, this man who'd given her everything she'd never known how to ask for, and felt the last of her walls crumble. "Yes," she said. "Yes." He slipped the ring on her finger and stood, pulling her into a kiss that warmed her more than any fire could. When they finally pulled apart, she was crying. "What's wrong?" Rhett asked. "Nothing. Everything. She struggled for words. "I never thought I'd have this. Any of this. And now I do, and I'm terrified I'll wake up and it'll be gone." "It's not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere." He wiped the tears from her cheeks. "You're stuck with me now." "Good." They went back inside, and Mara finished her bread with a ring on her finger and a lightness in her chest she'd never felt before. They married in February, on a day when the cold had broken just enough to make standing outside bearable. The ceremony was simple, just vows spoken in front of the men who'd become family, promises made with full understanding of their weight. Mara wore a dress borrowed from Curtis's wife, simple blue cotton that fit well enough. No veil, no flowers, just her and Rhett, and the life they were choosing together. When it was done, the men threw a party in the barn. Someone brought whiskey, someone else brought a fiddle, and they danced until the fire burned low and everyone was too drunk or too tired to continue. It was the happiest day of Mara's life. She moved into the main house with Rhett, her old cabin becoming storage. The transition was harder than she'd expected, learning to share space, learning to let someone else see all the parts of her she usually kept hidden. But Rhett was patient. He gave her room when she needed it and pulled her close when she didn't. Slowly, she learned what it meant to be married, to have a partner, to build a life with someone instead of just surviving alone. Winter finally broke in late March. The snow melted, the creeks ran high with runoff, and the world came back to life in increments. Green pushing up through dead grass, birds returning, the sound of everything waking up. Mara planted her garden bigger this year, added herbs she'd learned were useful medicinally, vegetables that would feed more people. The work was hard but satisfying. Her hands in the dirt, the sun warm on her back. This was home, really home. Not just a place she stayed, but a place she belonged. By summer, the ranch had become something more than just an operation. It was a community. People came not just for work or cattle, but for Mara's kitchen, for her healing, for the sense that this was a place where people took care of each other. Travelers started stopping through regularly. Word had spread about the woman who ran the best kitchen in 3 counties and could cure what ailed you besides. Some stayed for a meal. Others stayed for days, helping with work in exchange for food and shelter. Mara fed them all. The kitchen expanded. Rhett built an addition, added more tables, made room for the crowds. What had started as a way to keep ranch hands fed became something closer to a public house, though they never charged for food. People paid what they could, worked it off, or just said thank you and moved on. It worked because Mara had learned something essential over the past 2 years. Giving didn't make you weak. It made you necessary. And being necessary, being needed in a way that mattered, was its own kind of strength. She'd also learned to accept help. The 2 women she'd trained in town, Mary and Elizabeth, had taken to the work with an enthusiasm that surprised her. They handled most of the basic cases now, freeing Mara to focus on the more complicated situations. It meant she could breathe, could take a day off without feeling like she was abandoning people, could trust that the work would continue whether she was there or not. That was new, and terrifying, and freeing all at once. Porter died that fall. His heart, the doctor said, quick and painless for whatever that was worth. The whole ranch mourned him, but Mara took it hardest. He'd been one of the first to accept her, one of the first to see past his own prejudices and recognize what she was worth. At his funeral, she spoke, talked about how he'd taught her that people could change, that first impressions weren't final judgments, that stubbornness was sometimes just another word for loyalty. The men listened in silence, and when she finished, Gage stepped forward. "Porter would have been proud to hear that," he said. "He thought a lot of you. Told me once you were the backbone of this place. Guess he was right." After the funeral, life went on. Because that's what life did. It kept moving forward whether you were ready or not. Mara learned to live with the grief. Learned that losing people you cared about was part of the price of letting them in. But she'd pay that price again in a heartbeat, Because the alternative, keeping everyone at arm's length, never risking the pain, meant never having anything worth losing in the first place. She turned 30 that winter. Rhett threw her a party she pretended to hate and secretly loved. The whole ranch showed up, plus half the town. Someone brought whiskey, someone else brought a fiddle, and they danced in the expanded kitchen until the fire burned low and everyone was too exhausted to keep going. Curtis's wife pulled Mara aside at one point. "You've built something special here, you know that, right?" "We all built it." "Don't give me that." "This started with you. Your kitchen, your healing, your refusal to turn anyone away. The rest of us just followed your lead." Mara didn't know what to say to that. "I'm serious," the woman continued. "Before you came, this was just a ranch. Now it's a place people talk about, a place people come to when they have nowhere else to go. That's because of you." After everyone left, Mara and Rhett sat by the fire, her feet in his lap while he rubbed the ache out of them. "Happy birthday," he said. "It was perfect." "You say that every year?" "Because it's true every year." She looked at him. "Thank you for all of this. I didn't do anything. You gave me a chance when no one else would. You saw something in me I didn't see in myself. That's everything." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "I saw what was always there. You just needed the right place to let it out." Maybe he was right. Maybe she'd always had this capacity for caring, for building, for creating something that mattered. Maybe Red Hollow had just been too small, too limiting, too set in its ways to let her be anything other than invisible. But here, at Calder Ridge, she'd found space to become who she was always meant to be. And that made all the difference. The years rolled on. 3, 4, 5. The ranch continued to grow, continued to evolve. The kitchen became famous enough that people would detour miles out of their way just to eat there. The healing work expanded to include a small building in town where Mary and Elizabeth saw patients 3 days a week. Mara oversaw it all, but she'd learned to delegate, learned to trust others to do the work she'd once thought only she could handle. It was freeing, terrifying, necessary. She and Rhett talked about children sometimes. Whether they wanted them, whether it was the right time, whether they could handle adding that to everything else. They never quite decided. And then one spring, Mara realized she was pregnant. The pregnancy was hard, harder than she'd expected. Morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that made her want to sleep 16 hours straight, aches and pains in places she didn't know could hurt. But she kept working, modified what she did, let others pick up more of the load, but kept showing up. Because showing up was what she did. The baby, a girl, came in early winter. A long, brutal labor that left Mara convinced she was going to die, followed by the most perfect moment of her life when they placed her daughter in her arms. They named her Elizabeth, after one of the women Mara had trained. Beth, for short. Beth changed everything. Made the world both bigger and smaller all at once. Made Mara understand finally what it meant to love something more than yourself. She cut back on work for the first few months, let others handle the kitchen and the healing while she figured out how to be a mother. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, and she'd stitched up dying men and survived poisoning and faced down hostile crews. But slowly, she found her footing, found a way to balance motherhood with everything else. Found that the same skills that made her good at feeding people and healing people made her good at raising a daughter. Beth grew up in the kitchen, learning to cook before she could read. Grew up watching her mother tend to sick people, learning early that helping others was just what you did. By the time Beth was 5, she was helping serve meals. By 10, she could run the kitchen on her own if Mara needed her to. More children came to the ranch over the years. Not Mara's, but others. Orphans mostly, or kids whose parents couldn't care for them. The ranch took them in, gave them work, gave them purpose. Gave them what Mara had found here, a place to belong. It wasn't planned. It just happened. One kid, then another, then a handful. Before Mara knew it, they were running something close to a home for lost children, alongside everything else. It made sense, in a way. Mara knew what it felt like to have nowhere to go, knew what it meant to be overlooked and dismissed. If she could keep even one kid from experiencing that, it was worth the extra work. Rhett supported it without question, built more cabins, expanded the bunkhouse, made room for however many children showed up. "You're building an empire here," he told Mara one night, watching the kids eat dinner in the crowded kitchen. I'm just feeding people. Same thing. Maybe it was. The ranch became known for three things: the best food in the territory, the woman who could heal almost anything, and the place that took in children no one else wanted. Mara was proud of all three. But the last one mattered most, because she remembered being that child. Being the one no one wanted, the one people looked past, the one who didn't seem to matter. And now she was making sure no other child had to feel that way. Not on her watch. The years kept rolling. Beth grew up strong and capable, more interested in ranching than cooking, but skilled at both. She married young, to one of the hands Rhett had hired years before, and gave Mara grandchildren who ran through the kitchen like tiny tornadoes. Mara slowed down as she got older. Let the next generation take over more of the work. But she never fully stopped. Even in her 60s, she'd be in the kitchen at dawn, preparing bread or checking on whoever needed checking on. "You're supposed to be retired," Beth would tell her. "I'll retire when I'm dead." "Mom, I'm not ready to stop yet. Don't rush me." Rhett aged alongside her. His hair went gray, then white. His hands got stiff with arthritis. But he still ran the ranch, still made decisions, still showed up every day the same way Mara did. They'd been married 30 years when he had the stroke. It was sudden. One minute he was fine, the next he was on the ground, half his face not working right, his words coming out wrong. Mara held his hand in the wagon all the way to town, willing him to be okay, bargaining with anyone who might be listening that she'd give up anything if he could just survive this. He did survive, but he was different after, weaker, tired in a way he'd never been before. They both knew what it meant. The stroke was a warning. The next one might not be so kind. Mara refused to accept it, refused to slow down, refused to prepare for a world without him in it. She kept working, kept pushing, kept pretending everything was fine. Until one morning, Rhett didn't wake up. It was peaceful, the doctor said. His heart just stopped. No pain, no struggle. Just there one moment and gone the next. Mara sat beside his body and tried to understand how the world could still exist when he didn't. The funeral was massive. People came from 4 counties to pay their respects, to honor the man who'd built something good in a hard place, who'd treated people fairly, who'd loved his wife with a steadiness that had become legendary. Mara stood at his grave and listened to person after person talk about what Rhett had meant to them. And through the grief, she felt something else. Gratitude. For the years they'd had, for the life they'd built, for the fact that she'd gotten to love him and be loved by him. It wasn't enough. Would never be enough. But it was something. After the funeral, Beth tried to convince her to move into town. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Mom." "I'm not alone. I've got the ranch, I've got the kids, I've got work to do." "The ranch can run without you." "Maybe, but I'm not ready to find out." So she stayed, kept cooking, kept healing, kept showing up even when her body protested every movement, because stopping meant admitting it was over. And Mara wasn't ready for that. She lived another 10 years after Rhett died, long enough to see Beth's children grow up, long enough to see the ranch continue to thrive, long enough to know that what they'd built would outlast them both. On her last day, she was in the kitchen. Where else would she be? Beth found her there, slumped over the table, dough under her hands, peaceful, like she'd just fallen asleep. They buried her next to Rhett, under a tree they'd planted together 30 years before. The funeral was even bigger than his. People came from everywhere. People she'd healed, people she'd fed, people whose lives she'd touched in ways big and small. They told stories about the time she'd saved half the crew from poisoning, about the children she'd taken in, about meals that had felt like miracles when you were cold and tired and had nothing left. But the story that mattered most was simpler than that. It was about a woman who'd spent her whole life being told she didn't matter, who'd been overlooked and dismissed and treated as less than, and who'd refused to accept that as her final story, who'd walked into a hard place and made it softer through sheer determination and refusal to quit, who'd turned a job into a calling, a kitchen into a home, a ranch into a community, not because she was special, not because she was chosen, but because she'd shown up, done the work, given what she could, and refused to let anyone, including herself, tell her it wasn't enough. That was Mara's legacy, not the food or the healing or the empire she'd accidentally built, just the simple radical act of believing she mattered. and making sure everyone else knew they mattered too. The ranch continued for generations, became a landmark, a place in the stories people told their children. The kitchen still fed travelers. The healing work still saved lives. The children still found refuge. All because one woman had knocked on a door in the middle of winter and said yes to a job that terrified her. That was the real story. Not the success or the fame or the legacy, just the decision to try. Everything else came after. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.